The prevailing narrative is that wars break nations through bombs, invasions, and visible destruction. It is a story of armies, borders, and battlefield outcomes. But here is what that narrative deliberately omits. Most modern state collapses are not triggered by military defeat. They are triggered by financial suffocation, systemic fragility, and the slow breakdown of internal structures long before the first shot is fired. What you are witnessing now is not the beginning of collapse. It is the late stage of a process that has been unfolding quietly for years. The war is not the cause. It is the catalyst that exposes weaknesses already embedded in these systems. And once those weaknesses are exposed, they do not remain contained. They spread across regions, across markets, and across alliances in ways that are rarely understood in real time. The idea that 7 countries could move toward collapse simultaneously sounds improbable, even dramatic, but it is not a coincidence. It is a pattern. These states are not failing independently. They are connected through shared vulnerabilities, dependence on external financing, exposure to volatile energy markets, demographic pressures, and political systems that struggle to absorb shock. I am a geopolitical and financial systems analyst. I have spent over a decade studying state fragility, economic stress cycles, and the structural conditions that lead to collapse. In the next 25 minutes, I will show you 3 things that are not being discussed together. First, the underlying mechanism that turns regional conflict into multi-country instability and why it accelerates far faster than most forecasts predict. Second, the identity of the first country likely to cross the threshold from instability into systemic failure, and why it is not the one most analysts are watching. And third, the hidden force operating behind this chain reaction, a force that does not initiate collapse, but determines how far and how fast it spreads. Because once you understand that force, the sequence of events unfolding now stops looking chaotic and starts looking structured, and that is when the real implications begin to emerge. If you believe this kind of analysis matters, not as speculation, but as a way to understand how systems fail before they visibly break, then you already see why this conversation is different. The people watching this channel are not looking for comfort. They are looking for clarity before it becomes obvious to everyone else, before the pattern is packaged into hindsight and presented as inevitability. This is not an isolated discussion. It connects to a broader body of work examining how financial stress, energy shocks, and geopolitical conflict interact to create cascading instability across regions. There is a reason a separate analysis on systemic collapse cycles has become increasingly relevant to what you are seeing unfold now. For those who want to understand these dynamics early, to see the structure beneath the headlines, you are part of a much smaller audience that treats information as foresight rather than reaction. Because once you recognize the pattern, the idea of multiple countries collapsing at once stops sounding unlikely and starts looking inevitable. The modern map of instability is not defined by borders alone. It is defined by corridors, choke points, and exposure. Consider that over 40% of global trade passes through just a handful of maritime routes, while more than 60% of emerging market sovereign debt is denominated in foreign currencies. Now place 7 countries within this system, each positioned along critical transit corridors stretching from Eastern Europe through the Middle East into North Africa, where energy pipelines, grain routes, and financial dependencies intersect. In some of these states, over 70% of wheat imports originate from conflict-affected regions. In others, fuel imports account for more than half of total energy consumption, paid for in currencies they do not control. Their foreign exchange reserves, in several cases, cover less than 4 months of imports. These are not abstract vulnerabilities. They are measurable pressure points. Geography, in this context, is not just physical space. It is exposure to flows you cannot interrupt and dependencies you cannot replace. And for more than 3 decades, the global financial system has absorbed these imbalances through liquidity, credit expansion, and external guarantees. That changes tonight. The fractures do not begin where most observers are looking, they begin beneath the surface, in systems that appear stable until they are not. Crack 1. External debt dependency. Several of these countries have debt to GDP ratios exceeding 80%, but the more critical figure is that over half of this debt is denominated in foreign currencies, primarily dollars and euros. When global interest rates rise, their cost of servicing this debt does not increase gradually, it accelerates. A 1% increase in borrowing costs can translate into billions in additional obligations, forcing governments to choose between debt repayment and domestic stability. Crack 2. Import fragility. Many of these states rely on imported energy and food for more than 50% of domestic consumption. When supply chains are disrupted or prices spike, the impact is immediate. Inflation is not a slow process, it is a shock. In some recent cases, food prices have risen by over 30% within a single year, pushing large segments of the population into economic distress. Crack 3. Currency erosion. As capital exits these economies in response to uncertainty, local currencies weaken. This creates a feedback loop. A weaker currency makes imports more expensive, which drives inflation, which further erodes confidence, accelerating capital flight. In extreme cases, currencies have lost over 40% of their value within months. Crack 4. Political compression. Governments facing simultaneous economic and social pressures often respond with short-term measures, subsidies, price controls, or emergency borrowing. These actions provide temporary relief, but deepen structural imbalances. Political systems that were already fragile become more brittle under sustained stress. Crack 5. Security spillover. Conflict does not remain contained. Refugee flows, cross-border tensions, and internal security challenges compound existing weaknesses. Military spending rises at the exact moment fiscal capacity declines, creating a dual strain that few systems can sustain. Each of these cracks is dangerous on its own. Together, they form a reinforcing system of instability. When one intensifies, it amplifies the others. This is not a sequence of isolated failures. It is a synchronized breakdown. Nature abhors a vacuum. So does geopolitics, only more violently. Into that vacuum, three distinct forces are moving, each attempting to shape the outcome in its own way. The United States seeks to preserve the existing order through financial leverage and security guarantees. Its strategy is to maintain influence by stabilizing key states through institutions, alliances, and access to liquidity. Its greatest strength is the depth of its financial system and the global role of its currency. Its fatal blind spot is the assumption that liquidity alone can resolve structural weaknesses that are no longer cyclical but systemic. The United States is not losing, but the United States is no longer enough. China approaches the same landscape with a different strategy: infrastructure, trade integration, and long-term financing tied to physical assets. Its strength lies in its ability to deploy capital at scale and to integrate fragile economies into broader supply chains. Its blind spot is exposure. Many of these investments are concentrated in high-risk environments where political instability can undermine long-term returns. China is not losing, but China is no longer enough. Regional powers, including states in the Gulf and parts of Eurasia, pursue a strategy of selective influence, leveraging energy wealth and geographic proximity to shape outcomes in neighboring regions. Their strength is agility and local knowledge. Their blind spot is limitation. Their influence is significant but bounded, unable to stabilize multiple collapsing systems simultaneously. They are not losing, but they are no longer enough. And then there is the force that does not appear in military briefings or diplomatic communiques. The system that does not project power but defines it. The real winner is the architecture of financial control itself. The networks that determine access to capital, the systems that clear transactions, and the mechanisms that decide which economies remain liquid and which do not. This system operates quietly, almost invisibly. It is not controlled by a single nation, but it is dominated by a set of institutions and rules that govern global finance. At its core are payment systems, reserve currencies, sovereign debt markets, and the infrastructure that connects them. When a country loses access to this system, it does not collapse overnight. It suffocates. Credit dries up, trade becomes more expensive, investment disappears. Think of it as the circulatory system of the global economy. Nations are the organs, trade is the oxygen, and capital is the blood. As long as the system flows, even weak states can function. But when the flow is restricted, the effects are immediate and severe. Some organs adapt, others fail. What makes this system powerful is not just its scale, but its selectivity. Access is conditional. It can be expanded, restricted, or withdrawn. And these decisions are often made far from the countries they affect, based on risk assessments, compliance frameworks, and strategic considerations. The country or coalition that designs and controls the next evolution of this system will not need to dominate territory or deploy military force. It will shape outcomes by controlling access itself. The country that builds this system will hold more real power over global stability than any military force that has ever intervened in it. Sometime in the next 5 years, the pattern becomes visible to everyone. A mid-sized country, already under economic strain, faces a sudden external shock, a spike in energy prices combined with capital outflows. Its currency begins to fall rapidly. The central bank intervenes, burning through reserves, but the market does not stabilize. Within weeks, import costs surge. Food and fuel shortages begin to appear. International lenders hesitate. Credit ratings are downgraded. Access to global capital markets narrows. The government turns to emergency measures, but confidence continues to erode. Protests emerge, initially economic, then political. Security forces are deployed, increasing tension rather than reducing it. At the same time, neighboring countries begin to feel the pressure. Investors reassess risk across the region. Capital withdraws not just from one country, but from several. What began as a localized crisis becomes a regional one. Then the critical moment arrives. A major financial institution or coalition makes a decision, extend support under strict conditions, or restrict access entirely. This decision determines not just the fate of one country, but the trajectory of several others linked to it. And on that day, control will have shifted, not through invasion, not through occupation, but through access to the systems that sustain economic life. There are, however, conditions under which this trajectory does not fully materialize. A coordinated global response involving major financial institutions and leading economies could stabilize multiple vulnerable states simultaneously, providing sufficient liquidity to prevent cascading failure. This would require alignment that has been increasingly difficult to achieve. A second possibility is a rapid de-escalation of the underlying conflict, reducing pressure on energy and food markets and allowing fragile economies time to recover. This scenario depends on political decisions that remain uncertain. A third scenario involves structural reform within the affected countries themselves, fiscal consolidation, diversification of supply chains, and improved governance. While possible, these changes require time and stability, both of which are currently in short supply. If any of these conditions emerge strongly enough, the chain reaction slows or stops. But absent them, the pattern described here is not just possible, it is already in motion. The central thesis of this analysis is simple but uncomfortable. The emerging wave of state collapse is not being driven by war itself, but by the financial architecture that determines which nations remain economically viable under stress and which do not. Let me leave you with my prediction, stated plainly, so there is no ambiguity about what I am saying. Within the next 10 to 15 years, at least one of the currently vulnerable states we have discussed will move from chronic instability into full systemic failure, defined not by regime change, but by the loss of economic sovereignty and external control over its financial lifelines. The collapse will not be sudden, it will be procedural. The verdict is this: collapse will look administrative before it looks catastrophic. The role of the United States and the broader Western system will not disappear, but it will become increasingly reactive. Instead of shaping outcomes, it will be forced to respond to crises it can no longer preempt, deploying liquidity selectively rather than systemically. Influence will remain, but control will narrow. The verdict is this: power will persist, but initiative will fade. Regional powers will expand their influence, but not through dominance. States in the Gulf, parts of Eurasia, and emerging regional actors will stabilize selected zones, securing their interests where exposure is highest. They will not replace the global system, but they will fragment it. The verdict is this: regional power will grow, but it will not unify the system, and the real consolidation will occur within the financial architecture itself. The institutions, networks, and systems that govern access to capital will become more selective, more conditional, and more decisive. Countries will not fall based on military defeat, but on whether they remain inside or outside these systems. The verdict is this: access will matter more than sovereignty. I want to be honest with you about what this means. Those who believe in democratic and liberal systems will find this trajectory deeply unsettling, because it suggests that political legitimacy alone will not protect states from systemic failure if the underlying economic structures are weak. Stability will depend less on ideology and more on structural resilience. Those who prioritize national sovereignty will find a different tension. The ability to make independent decisions will increasingly depend on integration into systems that are not fully controlled domestically. Sovereignty will not disappear, but it will become conditional, shaped by access to external networks. And those who focus on economic access and financial security will recognize a more immediate implication. The stability of everyday systems, from currency value to access to goods, will be influenced by forces far beyond national borders. Economic security will become less predictable, more dependent on global structures than local conditions. The world is not moving toward a more familiar version of the same old order. It is moving toward something genuinely new. At the beginning, we spoke about 7 countries, not as isolated cases, but as nodes within a larger system under strain. That number is not arbitrary. It represents a threshold, a point at which instability stops being regional and becomes systemic. 7 interconnected pressures, 7 points of failure, each reinforcing the next. What once looked like separate crises begins to reveal itself as a single structure under stress. And once that structure begins to give way, the question is no longer which country fails first. It is how far the pattern extends. If you stayed until this point, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. This is not about headlines. It is about understanding the systems that sit beneath them. Tell me in the comments, which scenario do you believe is most likely, and why? I read every response because the most valuable insights often emerge from those willing to think beyond the obvious. The next analysis will go somewhere most channels will not, into the architecture that quietly determines who rises and who falls. Stay curious, stay informed. Question everything, especially the analysis that tells you the answer is simple.